Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the fifth and final webinar of our HEART program. I am Stacy Bowe, Training Coordinator for the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and I am here with Ella Weiner, who is our Training Project Assistant, who is providing technical backup today. And thanks everyone for joining. So just waiting to see how we're doing. Okay. Yeah, let's get started. Okay, so even though this is our fifth webinar, I'm still going to do some introductory comments for anyone who has not joined us before. And just to get everyone on the same page, HEART stands for Heritage Emergency and Response Training, which is a week-long program sponsored by the Heritage Emergency National Task Force and hosted by the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. Financial support for these webinars is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we are thrilled to have their support, as well as the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for the HEART program overall. So the goal of HEART is to provide realistic hands-on training on damage assessment, rapid documentation, emergency evacuation and salvage, crisis communication, and of course, team building. And this 5-part webinar series builds upon the in-person HEART program, as you can see here on our slides. Because we want to reinforce these concepts covered in the in-person training. And these webinars are diving more deeply into topics of interest and importance to cultural heritage responders. And our first HEART program was held last November in Washington, D.C., and we welcome the graduate class to this webinar. Hi, everybody. And not last month, back in March, we completed HEART Puerto Rico, where we brought a very similar hands-on training to museum professionals around the territory. And we hope to help with the ongoing recovery work on that island. So again, welcome HEART Puerto Rico graduates. Glad to see some familiar names on the list again. But whether or not you participated in this training, we still think you'll find these webinars interesting and informative. When the series is over, which is very soon, the webinar recording will be uploaded to HENTEF's website, which is culturalrescue.si.edu/HENTEF. And again, that URL, we'll bring that back up at the end of the presentation today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ella to talk about the technical side of things.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just a few quick notes. You'll see my email at the bottom of the screen there. It's winere@si.edu. Feel free to reach out to me if you're having any sort of technical issues with the GoToWebinar platform. You can also submit a question directly through GoToWebinar, and I'll be keeping an eye on those. Also, throughout the presentation, if you have any questions for our illustrious presenter, Lori, whose headshot you see right there, feel free to submit them through the questions box, and I'll be keeping an eye on them as we go through. And it's a great opportunity to get your questions answered. Lori has kindly offered to share her presentation with you. So in the handout section, you'll see a PDF that is available for your download and your reference. And then one last quick note is towards the beginning of Lori's presentation, I'm going to be launching a few polls that we're going to ask you to respond to. So it'll be a simple question, and then we're just looking for your participation to help make this webinar as effective and useful for you as possible. Okay, thanks, Stacey.
Thank you, Ella. And yes, illustrious indeed, Lori Foley. I have the pleasure of introducing today. And for those of you who this is your first time meeting Lori, let me just give you a little bit of background info. She is currently the administrator of the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which we pronounce that the acronym as HENTEF, which is a public-private partnership between Fema and the Smithsonian Institution. She advocates, and I do mean advocates, for the protection of cultural heritage at Fema and other federal agencies, and communicates with cultural, historical, and arts organizations following a major disaster to ensure that they receive the assistance they need to respond to and recover from disasters. Prior to joining FEMA, Lori was Vice President of Emergency Programs at Heritage Preservation, where her responsibilities included creating and supporting local and statewide cultural heritage emergency networks. Lori is a National Heritage Responder of the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation. She's a member of the International Association of Emergency Managers and a member and advisor to numerous statewide cultural heritage emergency networks. So we're very glad to have her today. She is actually presenting from sunny Puerto Rico as we speak, or I'm assuming it's still sunny, Lori. But thank you so much for presenting today, and I now turn it over to you.
Thanks, Stacy, and thanks, Ella. And good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Thank you for tuning in. So I'm not a public assistance specialist, nor do I play one on TV. But over the years, I've worked with many cultural institutions that have struggled with the public assistance process, and some have given up in frustration and despair because the process proved to be too overwhelming. Public assistance is challenging to navigate, but I hope this webinar can help familiarize you with the process. So when, not if, you're hit by a disaster, you'll be better prepared to apply for federal disaster assistance. If there are emergency managers tuning in, I hope this webinar will help you better understand the needs and priorities of cultural institutions. After all, you play a role in protecting and supporting them as a valuable part of your community. So let's start with those questions. So I know who's on the other side of my computer. Go for it, Ella.
All right, so there you see your first poll. So just go ahead and click your answer. And we'll give you, I'm keeping an eye on about how many of you are responding. All right, I'll give you guys another few seconds. So far, we have about 95% of people saying they are emergency managers. 95% saying they're cultural stewards and 5% saying they're emergency managers. Thank you to all of you who have responded. Lori, you ready for the next one? Oh, no, now we went up to 13% saying they're emergency managers and 88% saying they're cultural stewards. Okay, so I'm going to close this poll and then ask you guys the next question. Okay, so the next question is your institution a private nonprofit or a governmental agency? Please let us know. Right now we're split about 50% on each side. All right, perfect. I'll give you guys another second to respond. And it's looking like it's ending up that 56% of our webinar participants today are part of a government agency and 44% are part of private nonprofits. Okay, here's our third poll. Have you or has your organization ever applied for public assistance? Please let us know. Thank you for all your responses so far. As of now, we have about 75% of participants saying their organization or themselves have not applied for public assistance. So I'll give you guys another few seconds to submit your responses, and then we have one more question after this. Okay, so it looks like the final tally is about 77% of people have not and 23% of people have. Okay, our last poll, if you answered that you have applied for public assistance, what was your experience like? Good, bad, ugly? And you feel free to check not applicable if you have not applied for public assistance. So far, we have actually so of course, about 85% say not applicable, about 13% are saying good, and about 4% are saying ugly, and 0% have said bad. So give you guys another few seconds to respond. Okay, looks like we're holding steady at about 13% good, 4% ugly, and the rest not applicable. Thank you guys so much for your responses to those polls. It's really helpful for us to get a sense of who's joining us today. Okay, Lori, back over to you.
Thanks, Ella. That's really interesting, and I do hope that those of you who had good experiences will be willing to say, comment, and especially the people who did not have such great experiences, the ugly responses. Hopefully this will help you get over that ugliness, and we'll have a better experience the next time.
Great.
So for those of you thanks, Ella.
Yeah, no problem.
For those of you unfamiliar with the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, or as Stacy called it, HENTF, let me provide a brief introduction. So this slide shows you where HENTF sits under the Department of Homeland Security umbrella. FEMA is one of 7 agencies under the jurisdiction of DHS. FEMA's 2018 through 2022 strategic plan was recently released. And goal number 1 is to foster a culture of preparedness in order to create a more resilient nation. So to help meet this goal, coming up on May 28, a new resilience organization is going to consolidate FEMA's preparedness programs and grants, insurance, mitigation, and continuity programs. Under this new organization falls my administration, the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, or FEMA. The Office of Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation is within FEMA. It's the only office among 4 directorates. And within OEHP, the first P is silent, is the Readiness Branch, which is one of 3 branches in OEHP. And HENTF is nestled within the Readiness Branch. In 1995, a partnership was established among cultural and historic preservation leaders and federal officials to coordinate for the very first time a national approach to disaster response that incorporated cultural heritage concerns. Cultural stewards at American museums, libraries, and historic sites realized after a number of wake-up calls that included Hurricane Hugo, the Loma Prieta earthquake, the Midwest floods in '93, and the Northridge, California earthquake in '94. After those events, these cultural stewards realized that they certainly weren't prepared to respond to emergencies in their own institutions, and were certainly not prepared to come to the aid of their neighbors. HENTF has had 42 partners for years, and its membership has grown to 58 after last year's annual meeting expanded membership to include, among other private nonprofits, arts and tribal organizations. This list shows the 58 national service organizations and federal agencies that comprise HENTF. The federal agencies are shown in red, and the national service organizations, private nonprofit, professional, so-called trade organizations, are in black. Each member has a network of stakeholders and the ability to push information out to their constituents, and each has the ability to gather information, such as reports of damage, from their neighbors and pass them along to HENTF. So Stacy gave you the URL of the Cultural Rescue Initiative, and so this is the homepage of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, or SCRI as we fondly call it. And within that, we have HENTF's web pages living alongside those of SCRI's. The mission of the Heritage Emergency National Task Force is to protect cultural heritage from the damaging effects of natural disasters and other emergencies. NTEF has a formal role under a national planning framework, the National Response Framework. NTEF supports Emergency Support Function 11, or ESF 11, Agriculture and Natural Resources Annex. I know the word cultural doesn't appear in the Annex name at all. I think it was decided that cultural resources best fell into this ESF bucket because it didn't fit into any of the other ESF buckets. NTEF works closely with the Department of Interior's Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance, or OEPC. OEPC's charge is the protection of natural and cultural resources and historic properties, or NCH. There'll be a pop quiz at the end about all these acronyms. NTEF has a formal role in recovery as well, both short-term and long-term. It's a supporting organization of the Natural and Cultural Resources Recovery Support Function of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. Here, too, we work very closely with the Department of Interior's Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance, the coordinating agency for this recovery support function. I'm not going to read these objectives to you, but I do want to point out that our target audience comprises cultural stewards, first responders, and emergency managers. Our fifth objective actually works with the public, trying to help them stabilize, protect, and recover possessions before, during, and after an event. And this is especially important now as hurricane season will soon be upon us. Each NTEF member organization or agency has a mission that aligns with at least one of these objectives. NTEF sits at the intersection of the cultural community and the emergency management community. Each of these communities has a separate vocabulary and has different priorities following a disaster. These two disparate communities need to work together for the protection of our cultural heritage. And Stacy spoke about the trainings that were offered through HEART. And so I'd like to give a big shout out to the 50 HEART participants here in Puerto Rico, as well as the ones on the mainland. Another NTEF objective is to provide technical assistance, guidance, and/or resources. Here in Puerto Rico, NTEF work with the Department of Interior and other federal agencies to bring training in mold removal from collection materials and the all-important health and safety following the devastating hurricanes Irma and especially Maria. Much of my time last fall and up through today has been devoted to providing guidance to cultural institutions, pointing them in the direction of public assistance to obtain much-needed federal disaster dollars, and pointing them as well to other federal and private funding opportunities when they arise. Are there any questions so far?
I think you're good as of right now.
All right, thanks, Ella. So what is the Public Assistance Program? This is the only slide I'm going to read to you, but it's important to underscore what this says. The Public Assistance Program is a reimbursement, see we have it in bold and underscored. It's a reimbursement program that provides funding to eligible applicants, so you have to go through a vetting procedure, who have suffered damages as a result of a presidential disaster declaration. So a small regional emergency or an institutional emergency does not stand up to public assistance program, and whose damages are within a designated area for public assistance. In an area-wide disaster, it's often possible that an entire state or an entire territory the entire area has been designated damage area, but sometimes it's just a county or a number of counties, not the whole thing. Funding under this program is limited to repairing or replacing damaged items and facilities to their pre-disaster condition at the approved cost share. So the pre-disaster condition means just bring it back to the way it was, not necessarily bringing it back to a better condition at the approved cost share. Cost share is traditionally shared, with FEMA providing 75% and the private nonprofit or the government providing 25%, paying 25%. That varies on a disaster by disaster basis. Additional funding may be provided once all other financial offsets have been exhausted. So you have to go through insurance. You have to see if there are cash donations to help offset what would possibly be given to you through the public assistance program and any other grant awards. In other words, FEMA is the funder of last resort. Public assistance, or PA, is provided through a grant to the state or territory, known as the grantee, administered by the state or territory's emergency management agency or its authorized representative. It's sub-granted to eligible sub-recipients or applicants for eligible work as defined under the public assistance program. And this might sound like a lot of jargon and gobbledygook. I hope I can help you understand that as we move forward. So this is where I'm just going to take you in this webinar. I'm going to walk you through the public assistance process just up to this step. Once you get to this step, you'll be in good hands. You'll be in the great hands of a public assistance specialist who will serve as your caseworker until your work is completed and closed out. I would put all of you to sleep if I tried to forge all the way through to the very end of this graphic. So bam, disaster strikes, the incident occurs. If your institution suffers damage, knowing what public assistance is and what public assistance can do for you is crucial for the recovery of your building and the collections that it houses. This is what happens following a significant event. These actions are dictated by the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, also known as the Stafford Act. The Stafford Act is a federal law designed to deliver federal disaster assistance to support, and I underscore the word support, state and local governments in carrying out their responsibilities to assist and aid citizens. Getting to a major disaster declaration usually entails these steps. The local government responds, perhaps supplemented by neighboring communities and volunteer agencies. If they are overwhelmed, they turn to the state for assistance. The state responds, or territory responds, with state or territorial resources, such as the National Guard. A damage assessment is conducted by local, state, federal, and volunteer organizations to determine losses and recovery needs. A major disaster declaration is then requested by the governor based on the damage assessment and an agreement to commit state funds and resources to the long-term recovery. The FEMA Regional Administrator, so here you see what the FEMA regions are. The FEMA Regional Administrator in the impacted state evaluates the request and recommends action to the White House based on the disaster, the local community, and the state's ability to recover. The President approves the request, or FEMA informs the governor that it has been denied. This decision process could take a few hours or several weeks, depending on the nature of the disaster. It could also be appealed. As a result of the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, federally recognized Indian tribal governments now have the option of pursuing a declaration directly from the President. Remember, though, that most disasters don't rise to the level of a major disaster declaration. There are three filings that I want to hammer home if your institution suffers damage. Whether or not the President declares a major disaster, one of the first things you should do is file a claim with your insurance company ASAP. You can't get very far into the PA process if you don't file a claim with your insurance company. FEMA wants proof of that letter from your insurance company, and then it will consider providing assistance if you still have damages that were not covered by your insurance company. Note that the deductible that you pay can be reimbursed by FEMA if your institution is deemed an eligible applicant. So all is not lost, except for my audio. Once the disaster is declared, the state or territory becomes the recipient because the recovery funds will come from FEMA and flow to the state. The state or territory conducts briefings for the applicants, which could be private nonprofits or government entities. An applicant briefing provides a high-level overview of the public assistance program. These meetings are convened by the state or territory and not by FEMA. The topics it normally covers are shown here. For government entities, attendance by department heads, emergency management coordinators, a finance representative, and those who are going to be directly involved in administering the program on behalf of each applicant is recommended. And the chief elected official for each jurisdiction is highly encouraged to attend because all this information is going to be flowing through them. More often than not, private nonprofits or PNPs are not on the radar screen of the state or territorial emergency management agency that conducts the briefings. If PNPs haven't participated in these briefings previously or haven't applied for public assistance before, they may not get an invitation to attend. Therefore, cultural stewards need to be proactive. Check the website of your emergency management agency, listen for radio announcements, and scour the media to find out when and where these briefings are held. And for emergency managers in the audience who have the ability to help push this information out, make sure it gets to places that you would think cultural stewards would be frequenting or visiting. Any questions?
Not so far, but if any of you guys have any questions, please feel free to send them in.
Applicants have 30 days from the date of the declaration to submit a request for public assistance. For catastrophic disasters, this date could be extended multiple times, but you really have to pay attention to those dates. If you miss them, you cannot be considered for federal disaster assistance through public assistance. And so for those of you, those emergency managers in positions to be able to publicize, again, make sure that the outreach includes people, includes the private nonprofit community. This is what the RPA, the Request for Public Assistance form, looks like. It's just one page, so it's not too onerous to fill out. State and territorial governments are eligible applicants. Federally recognized Indian tribal governments, including Alaska Native villages and organizations, are eligible applicants. Local governments can include, but certainly aren't limited to, counties and parishes, municipalities, cities, towns, boroughs, barrios, and townships, local public authorities, school districts, state-recognized tribes. That, again, is not a comprehensive list of possible local governments. If you represent a government entity, there's a possibility that you participated in a preliminary damage assessment, which is what I'm pointing to there with that red arrow. If your institution is a private nonprofit, you check the box indicating so. Once you submit your form to the territory or the state, it then gets processed there and then passed along to FEMA. And FEMA has to determine whether you're an eligible applicant. To be an eligible private nonprofit applicant, the private nonprofit has to show that it has, one, a current ruling letter from the Internal Revenue Service granting tax exemption or documentation from the state that substantiates it as a non-revenue producing nonprofit entity organized or doing business under state law. You also have to provide the organization's charter or bylaws. You have to complete a one-page private nonprofit facility questionnaire. And if your facility is a school or educational facility, you'll need to attach information on accreditation or certification. In addition to documenting tax-exempt status, a PMP also has to provide proof of ownership, or if you lease your facility, proof of responsibility for repairs to the damaged facility at the time of the disaster. You must also provide documentation that demonstrates what percentage of the facility is used for eligible purposes. Note that states and territories might request additional information from you. So again, heads up, pay attention. The Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, or get this, Papa G, includes all policies affecting FEMA's public assistance program. If something's not in there, it's either not covered or a high-level discussion is probably necessary to determine disposition. The latest version, which is shown here, 3.1, includes revisions such as clarifications related to houses of worship and prohibited construction in coastal high hazard areas. And there are also some changes in terminology. Private nonprofit eligibility is determined in part by whether the private nonprofit offers critical or essential services of a governmental nature and the critical nature of services provided. Eligible service providers generally fall into two categories, and private nonprofits that provide critical services and non-critical or other essential services. I know that sounds like, what? Critical service private nonprofits provide the services that are shown here that are essential to a community's viability. They're critical to a community's viability. Non-critical private nonprofits provide other essential social type services to the community. Private nonprofits in the arts and cultural community are finally getting incorporated into Fema policy and guidance, and you see it reflected here in references to eligibility in terms of art services, arts programming, libraries, museums, zoos, performing arts centers. But reading this, you would think, that doesn't give you a lot of leeway in terms of types of institutions. When we think of museums, we often just think of art museums, and when we think of libraries, we often just think of our local public library. The Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, a federal funding agency, provides a broader definition of these cultural institutions. And I'd like you to bear this list in mind following a disaster. So an arboretum could be an eligible applicant. A planetarium could be an eligible applicant. A library consortium could be an eligible applicant. As private nonprofits, you might be eligible for disaster assistance under public assistance. So your second filing should be the RPA form. After all this about eligibility, I'm telling you, don't dither about whether you are eligible or not. Don't you decide or self-select yourself out of the pool. Let FEMA determine your status and submit that form by the filing deadline. Again, sometimes these deadlines are extended, so you need to be on the lookout for extensions announced by your state or territory. So you've submitted your RPA, you've been approved as an eligible applicant, and you're in the process of collecting all the documentation that you need. But wait, there's more. You need to know about categories of work. Emergency work consists of actions that have been taken to address an immediate threat. Category A, or Cat A, is debris removal. Cat B is emergency protective measures. I'll speak a little bit more on these in the next few slides. For most private nonprofits, the category of permanent work that most applies to you is Category E, buildings and equipment. Debris removal, Category A, includes the actions listed here, but other actions may also be related to the removal of debris. So take copious notes, document everything, make sure you're recording people's times, who's doing what and when. Document, document, document. For private nonprofits, eligible emergency protective measures are generally limited to activities associated with preventing damage to an eligible facility and its contents. So those activities can include the ones shown here. It might include putting a blue roof on, putting a tarp on your facility. It might mean wet vacuuming, tearing out wet saturated carpeting and getting rid of it, vacuuming with a HEPA filtered vacuum cleaner, removing gypsum board, cleaning, contaminating heating and ventilation, which includes the ductwork, removal or relocation of collections to prevent damage or loss. So that last bullet is one that you might not think about. If you move collections to get them out of harm's way before a disaster strikes, that's considered eligible work. If you move them after disaster strikes to prevent damage, for instance, to protect collections from getting moldy in a high humidity and high temperature environment, that's also considered eligible work. The following measures are eligible for permanent work. So this is the other part from the emergency work. Repair or replacement of materials, equipment, exhibition furnishings, that is covered. Treatment of special library collections, but again, replacement of irreplaceable items simply isn't possible. So the replacement of rare books, manuscripts, and other fragile materials is not covered. Stabilization, how do you maintain both the environment as well as the materials that are held within your facility? Reasonable costs associated with just putting together a treatment plan for the collection or individual objects. So if you need to have a conservator come to your facility and examine the materials that need treatment, the cost of bringing of that person's work to examine the material, do a condition report, propose treatment options, and provide a quote, all that would be considered eligible work. And then the cost associated with restoring an item to pre-disaster condition treatment. Collections and individual objects are eligible for treatment if they are damaged as a result of the declared disaster, if they're located within the designated disaster area, and if your institution is deemed an eligible applicant. Damage caused by negligence, in other words, failure on your part to take prudent measures to prevent further damage is not eligible for FEMA assistance. Filing number 3, the SBA disaster loan. The U.S. Small Business Administration provides low-interest, long-term disaster loans to businesses of all sizes, to homeowners, to renters, and to private nonprofits to repair or replace uninsured or underinsured property that was damaged by a declared disaster. This is usually the killer filing. When private nonprofits look at this requirement that they have to apply to the Small Business Administration, they blanch and say, we cannot afford to take on a loan. We're already on the very edge. Solvency has always been an issue, and just maintaining, because they're private nonprofits, is always a challenge. So the thought of taking out a loan can be devastating, and many people just stop the public assistance process right then and there. But remember, you don't have to accept the loan that is offered. You must have a letter from the Small Business Administration, regardless of its determination, whether they offer you a loan, whether they deny you a loan. You need to have that paperwork in order for you to then move on to the next step, which is to be considered for public assistance and federal disaster aid through FEMA. If you are denied a loan by the SBA, or if your costs exceed what the SBA covers, then FEMA may be able to provide assistance. Several types of loan programs are available to private nonprofits. Businesses and private nonprofit organizations of any size can borrow up to $2 million through a business or physical loan. Applicants may be eligible for a loan amount increase up to 20% of their physical damages, as verified by the SBA, for mitigation purposes. I'm just checking to see whether you can hear me. Can you still hear me? My phone,
Can hear you, no
phone
problem.
just flashed. Okay, my phone just
no
flashed.
problem.
Okay, great, thanks. Interest rates are as low as 2.5% for nonprofit organizations. The loan amounts and the terms are set by the Small Business Administration and are based on each applicant's financial condition. Economic injury loans are also available for businesses that did not receive physical damage, but were adversely affected economically by disaster. So for instance, if you're a performing arts organization and your facility didn't suffer any physical damage, but you suffered from the loss of revenue because you weren't able to put on shows, then that is something that an economic injury loan might be able to cover. And again, I know it gives you the heebie-jeebies to think about having to take out a loan, but there are some options, and I'll talk to you about it. This is really one step to get you closer to public assistance federal funding. Applying to the SBA is a three-step process. I'm not going to walk you through any of this, but I have included it here for your reference at a later date. When you say a three-step process, not bad, but there are a lot of little things that go on. But this tells you what the actual process is. It's not as scary as you think. This page I'm not going to, again, read to you, but this gives you information about the business physical disaster loans. And this one describes the economic injury disaster loans. So here's a spreadsheet that talks about, a flow chart that describes the SBA loan outcome. So I'm going to walk you through it. Bear in mind, you should apply to both the SBA and FEMA concurrently to ensure that you meet all deadlines for applications to both programs. As part of the challenge of filing for public assistance, the request for public assistance date is completely, usually and almost always, different from the deadlines that are established by the Small Business Administration. So you have to keep one eye on each to make sure that you're not missing a deadline, because that will stop the process cold. So, are you a critical private nonprofit? Chances are, at least in this audience, you are not. But if you were, you would be eligible. Permanent work and emergency work would be eligible for you, to you. But let's say you are not a critical private nonprofit. You're not a utility. So no, but you have permanent work. You have objects that you want. You have collections that need to be treated. You have a building that needs to be repaired. You have shelving that needs to be replaced. So, do you have any permanent work? Nope. Nothing happened to your collections. So emergency work is eligible. But yes, you do have permanent work. You do want some help to treat your collections. You do want help to get to replace those computers that were damaged from the flooding. So yes. So you need to apply for a small business loan, Small Business Administration loan, again, within the SBA deadline. That's a key there. So if you don't apply, then you're not eligible to apply for permanent work. So your path ends right there. But if you do apply, and let's say that the SBA loan application is approved. So if it's not approved, that's actually a good thing. So then that money that you were asking for is actually going to be considered as money that you would then be applying through public assistance. Permanent work is eligible. But if your SBA loan is approved and the SBA loan fully covers permanent work costs, so if it fully covers the cost of permanent work, then you can't get any funding from FEMA for permanent work because it's covered by the SBA loan. But if it's not covered, any costs beyond the approved loan amount are eligible. Now, let's say you are offered a loan, but you don't want to take it. What happens is, if there are still costs beyond that amount that was given to you or that was offered to you, and you choose to turn down that loan, FEMA will subtract out the amount of that loan from whatever costs were beyond that approved loan. So you wouldn't necessarily, so you're not going around SBA to get funding from FEMA. That amount of money has been offered to you and you choose not to accept it. So FEMA will not pay you for that, reimburse you for that. Clear as mud. Does anyone have any questions on this slide?
No one submitted any questions for this slide.
Okay. I think everyone left after the call. All right. So here we are. not all the way through the process, but in good enough shape to rely on the public assistance specialist who will assist you the rest of the way. So this last part deals with the recovery scoping meeting. While the applicant briefing is designed to address high-level information for all potential applicants, the recovery scoping meeting is designed to address specific needs of each eligible applicant. So at the recovery scoping meeting, FEMA, the recipient, which would be the state or the territory, and the applicant, which would be you, the private nonprofit, discuss the topics that are shown here. The one that I want to pound into your head, because it's been pounded into my head since I've been here in Puerto Rico, documentation, documentation, documentation. If it's on paper, keep it. If it's not on paper, put it on paper and keep it. That paper trail is all important, because the last thing you want is someone coming knocking on your door and taking money that was given to you 5 years ago because something was amiss in the paperwork. So I've only taken you halfway through the PA process. Is this how you feel? Having a grasp of the process now is infinitely better than having to wrap your mind around it in the midst of the stress and the chaos that accompanies a disaster. So as Ella pointed out before, the PowerPoint slides have been provided as PDFs. Feel free to download them and use them as reference. And if you're suffering from insomnia, I highly recommend reading the 217-page Papa G. And that's all. Questions?
Cool,
So
thanks,
participants.
Lori.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Stacey.
Oh no, I was just gonna, thanks, Lori. Quick question though, is that last slide at the National Building Museum?
Yes, it is.
Aha.
Very good.
So now is question and answer time. Thanks, guys, for being patient again during our little audio blip. And in case that due to that, maybe something got lost or maybe Lori cut out before we got her back, feel free to ask those questions now. That's what she is here for. So while you guys are maybe gathering your thoughts, I actually had a question for you, Lori. I did not know that you could get preventive or preparation costs reimbursed. You mentioned that, correct?
Yes. So
Okay.
if you're taking emergency protective measures, if you're putting, and this applies not just to private nonprofits, but to any facility, if you're putting boards up, plywood boards to protect your windows from an oncoming hurricane, if you are battening down the hatches and you need to have staff work overtime in order to do some of those preparatory actions, preparedness actions, those could be eligible costs.
Okay, so I'm just kind of, okay.
Anything related to pre-disaster, if it's something like a notice event like a hurricane, or anything related to the hurricane afterwards. And so, for instance, your participation as a private nonprofit, your participation in the recovery scoping meeting could that time that you invest in that, the time that's invested in pulling all the paperwork together, the time invested in photocopying so you can provide information to FEMA, keep track of those hours, those minutes, they add up, and that is something that can be used as part of your cost share.
Okay, very interesting. So again, even if I mean, because hurricanes are very, dominant in our brains right now, I'm just doing a hypothetical. So if a hurricane has been forecasted and you are starting to prepare to, hypothetical, batten down the hatches, even though you're spending money on doing those preventive actions, like you said, with the plywood, or even if you hired contractors to maybe move your collection, as part of an evacuation. So even if you survive because of those preparation activities, you can still apply to have those activities reimbursed. Is that correct?
There is a minimum amount of money, the time that would be required to do it. If you had minimal damage, you might choose not to apply for public assistance simply because the time and energy required and paperwork required does not get up to the minimum, which unfortunately I don't recall. It's around $3,000, but it's not around $3,000 for the minimum amount. But if you suffered, for instance, you do all that work, you keep copious notes, you keep track of your invoices. If it doesn't rise to the level of a major disaster declaration, then you don't get reimbursed. Again, it's a reimbursement program, so you're not going to be forwarded any money. You're getting reimbursed.
Okay, I forgot about the declaration too. That's also a risk. Well, I don't know if we want to call it a risk, but that's a caveat as well. If for whatever reason they forecast a hurricane, you go through all of this process of preparing for it, and then it actually ends up being not on the level of a presidentially declared disaster, then public assistance is not an option then, correct?
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we do have some questions now.
Yeah, so we've gotten a few questions come in from our participants. So one of our participants asked that if you apply for a permanent loan and end up not accepting it, but you still want the overage money from FEMA, how do they feel about it? Will they think you're trying to scam the system, or is this something that is commonly done?
That's part of the process. They don't think you're scamming it. I mean, all this work is done on the up and up because at any point along the way, it could be audited either now or 10 years down the road. So the process is quite clear to FEMA if people choose not to accept a loan, or if they are denied a loan and jumping up and down saying, hooray, that's the way it falls. It's fine.
Oh, gotcha. That's really
No worries.
interesting. Okay, so then we have another question from our participants from one of our participants who asked, does diesel for generators to keep an HVAC running to avoid collections damages, is that eligible? Are those eligible costs?
I do not believe so, but the number of hours that you have the generator going, there are formulas that are created that FEMA has in charts and tables that can be considered eligible for reimbursement. Right, strange.
All right, participants, do you have any additional questions?
I have well, actually, I think I've asked Lori this before, but just in case if anybody else hasn't heard me ask it before. So Lori, do you have a good example of a museum applying for public assistance and getting reimbursed, and actually showing like a good example that, throughout all of this red tape and governmental nonsense, it does actually work? Oh, and I'm not actually hearing a response from Lori, so maybe that doesn't bode well. There you are.
I'm here. So the University of Hawaii had a flash flood many years ago, and it ruined the water just went right through basements of the library, and that was a successful effort. It was a government entity, the University of Hawaii, so that probably did help but they were able to secure public assistance funding for the treatment of all the items that were damaged. Everything from photographs to cultural objects, tapa cloth, kahili, which are the feather standards. They were reimbursed. I mean, it was a huge paperwork effort, but they were able to get treatment done for the work. It requires a lot of stick-to-itness, but in the end, it was worthwhile.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear for sure. And as far as starting the process, since going back to the polls at the beginning of the presentation, so predominantly we've got a lot of cultural stewards in the audience today, but I bet within those cultural stewards we've got everyone up the chain of command. Are the applications for public assistance, are they initiated at the director of a museum or a nonprofit level only? Like, do you have to be the director to sign to these applications, or can a collections manager or a facilities manager submit these?
It would probably have to be the executive director, someone whose name can be put on the document, because that is the person who is ultimately held responsible. However, that doesn't mean that a curator, a collections care person can't bring it to the attention of the director and say, I really think we should apply for public assistance. Our collections suffered damage. It would be really good if we can get this into the process and get the paperwork started. You do not have to immediately provide dollar damage amounts at all. It's a process that although it can seem overwhelming, you're not asked to submit everything all at once. And if you forget something, or it's taking a while to get something to your public assistance, your PA specialist, it's on his or her radar, and they will remind you if you've forgotten. But again, it's the stumbling blocks, and what prevents people getting their funding quickly is, have they filed for insurance? Another document that has to be provided is your insurance company, your insurance policy. So there are people at FEMA who read insurance policies to see whether what you would be claiming is covered by an insurance claim, or if it's not. And so they are doing that to confirm or deny what the insurance company is saying. They will be cutting a check for you. So it's a gradual process, but the sooner you have the documents, and the more meticulous you are in corralling them and retaining them and filing them in an order that you can access, the faster the process can be. But it's the insurance, it's the filing. That piece of paper from the Small Business Administration has to be submitted to FEMA before FEMA will consider any additional funding going to the applicant through the public assistance program.
We also have a question that says, thinking about the fact that restoration efforts can take quite a long time, is there a deadline for when money must be spent?
There are usually deadlines, but those also could be negotiated. It's probably not the right word, but you can probably make the case for why it might take so long to do particular types of work. Project worksheets, which are the vehicle for making the funding available for a specific activity or activities. A time frame always has to be associated, a timeline, a deadline. But you're again in constant touch with the public assistance specialist, so you can be talking about that. So you're not all of a sudden up against the deadline and oops, you're not quite there yet with finishing treatment. Sometimes you're right, it could take a number of years before objects, a collection or a number of different objects within, from a private nonprofit, from a collecting institution, can be treated.
And that person is willing to work with you with knowing that, essentially?
Yes, yes, that's their
Okay.
job.
Okay, we do have another question that says, do you think it'd be worthwhile to have some application materials ready in advance of disaster, like tax exempt status, bylaws, facility questionnaires, and documents of that sort?
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Because in the mad chaos and stress and overwhelming nature of a disaster, being able to put your hands on a packet that's already prepared like that would be phenomenal. It really puts you ahead of the pack and gets you off to a good start, because then the process can be started and the money could potentially be flowing much sooner than all of a sudden you're trying to figure out, I know we have a copy of the bylaws somewhere, but what cabinet, what drawer is it in? Oh yes, it's in that drawer that flooded that we can't get to now because it's underwater. So having part of your preparedness be pulling these basic forms together and putting them someplace safe would be amazing and phenomenal. And I highly recommend it.
That's good to know. Thank you also to Claire for that great question.
And Lori, just thinking back to what we've seen in Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, how does public assistance get the applications and information out when there is no access to the internet following a disaster?
Communication was and continues to be a huge challenge, and I don't think we have thought long and hard enough yet about how that's going to work. I know people here in Puerto Rico drove using very valuable and very expensive fuel from where they were staying, where they lived, because there was no power, to the convention center, which is where the emergency operations center was, and the initial facility was staged. They drove there to fill out the paperwork by hand because there was no other way to get that information going. And even today, even though the power is much better throughout the island, there are still issues both here and in the Virgin Islands where the connectivity to the internet is not working yet. So I think that's something that we really have to be thinking long and hard about as disaster and hurricane season approaches, because that could very well be another issue, and not something that we want to have happen again, both from the private nonprofit and collecting institution standpoint, but of course from the life-sustaining standpoint as well.
Definitely something, yeah, we're very much aware of as we get further into the summer. Let's see, I'd say we probably have time for about one or two more questions. If you guys have any more hanging on in the back of your brains, don't feel shy. Go ahead and ask Lori. Let's see, the other question I wanted to ask you, Lori, as I'm looking at my notes, is oh yeah, so back to again to you don't have to have everything with you the moment that you start applying for assistance. So just to further clarify that, so if you are coming back to your building and you know you're going to need debris removal, and just thinking ahead, you know you're going to have to pay somebody to remove that debris removal, you can immediately say in your head, this is also assuming that we're in a presidentially declared disaster, that I'm going to submit this for public assistance. But it's okay that you haven't gotten a quote yet for what that debris removal is, correct?
Right, and usually it will take it'll take a little while before the reimbursement process is beginning for both the emergency work, for debris removal and emergency protective measures. So you will end up probably paying that contractor or whoever to remove the debris. And again, it's a reimbursement basis, so FEMA would reimburse you from that. You wouldn't be waiting for FEMA to write you a check and then you would do the work.
Okay, true. You would why is my
You would
printer
just hold on
Yep.
to you would just hold on to the documentation, the invoice that you got. You would pay it and then show the invoice.
And I mean, that's leading to the larger question that I know that Scry and many HENTEF members have been talking about. That alone can also be daunting and kind of a deal breaker for some of these nonprofits, that they might not have money that they can kind of, pony up essentially for these services, even if, there is this strong idea that they will get reimbursed by FEMA. And that's definitely something in the cultural rescue field that we are trying to brainstorm on for sure.
Right. How do you make that cost share, whether it's 10% or 25%, which is the normal cost share that you have to do? It could be volunteer time, but again, you have to document very carefully and fully who your volunteers are, what times they worked, when they checked in, when they checked out, what their activities were, and keep a very comprehensive list based on speaking with. Well, first you can consult Papa G. I'm sure there's an answer there for you. But making sure that you do. I mean, if you think it might be something. Even if you don't think it might be something worth jotting down, jot it down, especially in the aftermath of a disaster when you can't remember what you said 10 minutes ago. It's important that you just document everything. You write it all down. And again, the time that's devoted to any kind of activity put towards recovering from the hurricane, if you are found to be an eligible applicant, that time can be counted as forced account labor.
Also, thinking about related to Stacy's question, so for services like debris removal, do you need to use FEMA approved vendors, or does such a list like that exist, or how does one go about that?
So for debris removal, I believe you would just you could use whoever you want to move your debris. And if there are any emergency managers on who say that's not accurate, please correct me. You have to provide the invoice. And you have to prove what it is that company did. I don't know how it works. If you have Uncle Joe removing your debris and charging you $5,000, that would be something that you would really want to make sure that it's legitimate.
Okay, so there doesn't need to be some sort of government approved or stamped vendor, but you do have to prove that this is a legitimate price for the service that was provided and it was, conducted in a certain way.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I know we definitely stress, documentation all the time in HEART. So you're only further proving the many different types of documentation that are so important in the aftermath of a disaster.
Right. I do want to bring up the point for museums, libraries, archives that are governmental in nature and are under a larger umbrella like a municipality. I'm thinking more specifically about here in Puerto Rico, where there are museums, libraries, and archives that are municipal entities. And in speaking with them during our HEART program in Puerto Rico, they were saying, well, we don't know who to go to. And it's really important that they find the right person within the municipality to notify them that they have suffered damage, report the damage to that person in the municipality, that person responsible for collecting that damage data. Because the last thing you want is to be overlooked because no one heard your pleas for assistance. And conversely, people at the municipal level that are at the higher, either state, at a state agency, be mindful of of the entities that are in your care, that are underneath your umbrella, and ensure that they know who the point of contact should be when this process begins, because you'd need to make that information available. There are deadlines on when you can submit that information, and if you submit them too late, there's always a possibility that it might not be counted, and that's something that you really is something that is inexcusable, in that it has to happen. That communication has to be there. So again, this is a readiness step, preparedness step. Figure out who that point of contact would be should something bad happen, and you start working with your responsible entity on public assistance.
Yep, I would completely agree with Lori to start building those bridges now. Or if you've already started, keep going.
Right, and for you cultural institutions, make sure you have, at the very least, as hurricane season approaches, an up-to-date contact list with people's private phone numbers and emails, and dust off that disaster plan if you didn't do it on May Day, and start talking about it, because institutions that have had disaster plans and actually were able to implement them and use them always fare better than institutions that don't have one, or institutions that have one but no one's been trained to use it. So you've got some time to take advantage of it now. And that's where I'll end.
Thanks, Lori. All right, so thanks everyone for participating with your questions, and thanks so much for attending today's webinar. As we are wrapping up, I just want to say that you will be receiving a follow-up webinar survey to your email inboxes tomorrow, and it just has a few questions on what you thought of today's presentation. It really helps us, because since this is our inaugural webinar series, we definitely want to make sure how the next series can be improved and can be better. So please take a few moments to fill that out and send it back to us. And yes, thanks everyone who has joined us during this webinar series. We have now concluded our Heart webinar series. So thanks again to the graduates. Good job, guys. You get A+ for getting this far. If anyone has any questions for us, please email us at hentf, HENTF, @si.edu, and we look forward to hosting some Heart workshops actually in the U.S. Virgin Islands next month, and we'll definitely keep you all updated on our work down there. And hopefully we will be moving ahead with holding Standard Heart 2018 later this year. So definitely keep checking up on us on our website and our social media feeds, and we'll be posting some additional information there. So thanks again, guys, and thanks again, Lori, and thanks again, Ella. Everyone, have a great week.
Okay, thank you guys so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.